Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the next chapter of preparing your business for the next generation. I'm Bill Kennard with Grandy and Associates.
And I'm Glenn Herman with Creative Business Services.
Hey, great to have you here again, Glenn.
Yeah, looking good.
Hey, what can we say?
We have to, you'd almost think we coordinated.
We would almost think that.
But we didn't.
We're going to have to talk to our wives about this or something. I don't know.
Maybe they're talking.
That's right. Could be. So we're going to jump into the program again this week. And as we get started with our topic this week of really preparing your business and marketing it, as we get started, first things first, if you would, go ahead and just click on subscribe, click on the like button. If you're viewing this thing on either Facebook or on YouTube, that certainly helps get this word out to other people. So it's beneficial for you to do that. So we've got people logged in 3 different areas here today. So we've got a whole group logged in on the Zoom live feed. We've got people on the Facebook live feed, and we've got people on our YouTube live stream as well. Added in a little bit of a new wrinkle this week. So if you are watching on either Facebook or YouTube and you have a question as you go through it, you can put that in the chat, in the comments on Facebook and YouTube. That will show up on our end. We'll be able to see and address those. If you're on the YouTube, on the Zoom channel, watching it live there, if you have any questions, just right down at the bottom, click on the Q&A box down there, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. We won't be monitoring the chats. We're monitoring the Q&A tab. And as those pop up, we'll see them pop up right here in front of us, and we can go ahead and take care of those right away as they come in. So, man, the topic here, marketing your business. We're kind of circling around. I mean, over the last 8 months, 9 months now that we've been doing this, we've been circling around a number of different topics that pertain with that whole transition of the business, right? And I mean, you think about it throughout the months, we've talked about picking a successor. We've talked about finding the right person. We talked about the financial health of the business. We talked about getting the money out of it. We're starting to kind of take a little bit more of a holistic view here at this point, right?
Kind of reviewing what we've talked about in a little less detail, but covering some things that we may not have addressed earlier.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, we've received a couple of questions, or just double check your mic if you would, down below. We've been getting a couple of questions in here as far as okay, we talked about this particular topic, but how does it fit in with the rest of the puzzle piece? And so that's really what we want to be looking at, in this one. It's kind of that big picture and how does all this stuff fit together, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. So that's kind of where we're going, where we're heading here today. So now, as we've gone through this, and we'll do the same thing again, the last number of times that we've gone through it, there's a 10 different action steps in the entire succession process. And so we bring this up each time for those who are new in this particular session. And so these are those 10 steps that are there. Now, in just a minute, we'll go ahead and share this document. We've got a document which has got the individual 10 steps, as well as a couple of timelines that we're going to share in the chat box. So again, I'm going to bounce you back to the chat box for just a moment. And as we look at this one, again, we've got a 3-year and a 5-year timeline. Now, Glenn, when we talk about these timelines, again, as a reminder, is this when I start working on these individual items?
Really, I think it starts at the inception of a business, but 3 and 5 year, 5 years is really optimal. 3 years okay. Obviously, as a business broker, as a business intermediary, we work in situations where we literally a decision to sell the business has been made last week or last month, and we're in the process of. And
you're going to start working on it at that point. And I think we've talked about it in the past a little bit, but that kind of creates some problems, doesn't it?
It does, because you're battling a couple of things. Buyers are going to know. Typically, they'll be able to sniff that out. We try to eliminate that to the extent that we can, but you don't have the opportunity to correct unresolved opportunities or problems in your business. Oftentimes, in situations like that, it might be an illness or an injury that's forcing. Maybe it's a change in a dynamic within a family. There could be any number of reasons why that happens, but it's usually not advantageous.
Sure. And a lot of those sometimes fall under the D's, right? Death, drugs, divorce.
Right.
Yeah. And disability, some of those things that kind of run into there. So again, this is really the latest you want to jump into it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now you said a minute ago, right? And I caught it. It was quick, but you said really the best time is at the inception of the business.
I think with your business plan, when you establish your business and activity plans, you should be discussing and thinking about your exit strategy. What does that look like? Is it a financial hurdle that you're looking to hit before you sell? Is it a growth? Is it a market saturation type situation? Is this a timing thing?
Is it a timing? Is it when I can actually get X number of dollars out of it?
Right.
Could be.
Yeah.
Right. And so really that's where starting the process at the inception of the business, you think, well, hey, I'm in my 20s, just starting this business, right? I'm young. I got the rest of my life in front of me. Well, first off, you never know how much time you have, right?
Right.
And then on top of that, you run into the scenario where, timing might just be right, that for whatever reason, it makes sense for me to jump out now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you look at the situation we have right now economically, we're kind of coming out of it a little bit, but over the last couple of years, pandemic notwithstanding, of course, but over the last couple of years with interest rates being so low, there's always an inverse proportional relationship between interest rates and values. As interest rates are low, values are high, largely because there's more ability to fund.
Sure.
Money is cheaper. And so we're still in that position, but we're coming out of it.
Okay. So let me ask you that question because, we start looking at the rates are eking up. Actually, I think the Fed was talking about I think their terminology was a massive increase.
Yeah. Ouch.
Yeah. Right. And so that might be another full point or more. So how does that, what are you seeing, right? And I know I'm asking for a crystal ball and I didn't ask you this before, so you didn't prep, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it changes the appetite within certain categories of buyers. For instance, if you were a company that wanted to acquire your competition, that was a similar size, your appetite might change if the cost of acquisition increases by $10,000 or $15,000 more per month in payments. Now, conversely, there might be situations where a private equity firm might say, we have the money, and this is an opportunity for us to get a discount. This is an opportunity for us to take advantage of these interest rates being
because higher. If it's anybody but us, the price is going to have to be lower because of the higher interest rates. Okay.
Absolutely. It can also affect where you have larger companies doing what we call roll-ups, where they're buying a number of companies of smaller size. Maybe it's a geographic or demographic concern that they're trying to address in those roll-ups. When you have that, maybe they don't have the ability to buy as many companies. So if your location isn't exactly where they wanted to be, and I've seen that, I've actually had I'm starting to see that a little bit more, where out-of-state companies that are looking to expand their depth, geographically, are starting to slow back down a little bit, and they're trying to stay a little closer to home because obviously things like fuel, logistics, management costs, all those things change as the cost of doing business increases.
Sure. Right. Okay. So good. So again, we've got the 3-year timeline. We've also got a 5-year timeline. So Stacy has shared that in the chat box for you. Ready? You can go ahead and just click on that in the chat box. It'll download it to your computer. You've got that as a reference tool. So let's start looking into, again, a little bit bigger picture. We're not going to be real specific necessarily on items, but what are just this entire group of things that as we're preparing or marketing the business that we're starting to look at. So where do we start?
I always say start with evaluation. Whether or not you're in a position where you're going to be selling your business in 3 to 5 years, you should always know you should have a baseline. What's your starting point? Where's my business today? What's the value of my business today? Because oftentimes, as you mentioned, that that trigger for exit might be when I have enough money that I can pull out. And that obviously deals largely with valuation. That being said, valuation and pricing aren't always the same. There are situations, and recently I've had several situations where I've priced a business higher than what the numbers show on a valuation, simply because I was privy to information from that buyer, knowing what they're looking for in a contracting company.
Okay.
And those type of situations that's the experience that we bring to the table as a business intermediary and a business brokerage firm, because we have that direct experience. So
now, wait a minute. Let me just make sure I understood what you just said. Is that you had inside information from the buyer? So that would be a case where somebody has come to you. They're looking to buy a company.
Correct. That could be the case. It could be the case where we have somebody that's giving us the criteria that they're looking for, and it may be higher than what, they might say, hey, a typical company might be valued at $2 million, but I know they have an appetite based on these criteria and they're willing to pay more. Well, if that's the case, it opens up opportunity.
Sure.
Where I'm working for a buyer, obviously I try to keep that as low as possible. Where I'm working for a seller, that's where I will find that information out through conversations with the buyer.
Okay.
That's part of the salesmanship that we possess as business intermediaries. We know what questions to ask and how to probe to get answers, specifically to get intelligence on where they're at. What are they looking for?
Whereas if I'm selling my company, odds are I'm not going to be able to get that information
very unlikely
out of somebody who's, I'm talking to buy my company.
Right. Because your experience level just isn't there. It's just like, if you're trying to sell a furnace and you've never sold a furnace before, well, okay, you're probably going to have some success, but the metrics aren't going to be as strong as they would after you've sold 100.
Right. Absolutely. No question. Okay.
So go ahead.
Well, so we talk about always having this valuation, right? One of the other things that you had mentioned here was, and again, just to kind of review real briefly, is you said it's always worth having that baseline.
It is.
Right. So again, how often should I evaluation isn't just for when I'm selling the company?
Correct. I think it's the valuation process does a lot more to identify things in your financials. Strong financials. We talk about process all the time. When we're talking about Grandy and what you provide your clients, it's so important to have that process and those systems in place on the financial side, having things accurate. Having an accurate balance sheet is hugely important. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Your P&L has to be accurate. It has to be, because those are things that potential buyers are going to look at. But it's also, if you're not in a position where you're selling, a valuation is going to say, hey, here's something that you need to pay attention to.
Here's some weak spots.
Here's some opportunities. Absolutely. And I always tell people every 3 to 5 years, you should do a valuation. If we do a valuation, I typically will recast the financials at no extra charge 12 months after the valuation. So it's kind of like getting 2 valuations for the price of one.
You're a nice guy.
Well, it just allows more contact with the customer.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it's more the value that CBS brings to your customers.
Absolutely.
Right. Good. All right. So let's look at some of these items on the list here. Right. So valuation procedures. Right. So we look at getting that valuation, nature of the business.
Nature of the business is something that a lot of valuation firms, especially when you're talking about CPAs. CPAs can do a valuation. They're certified to do that. Appraisal companies likewise. But we have an in-house. Basically, it's our third party person in-house. They don't have contact with clients. So there's no undue influence in that. And we're not allowed to influence, obviously, the things that they talk about with us about the clients and things of that nature. It's very
third party, but it's actually an in-house person.
Yeah. It's an in-house valuation specialist that when she does a valuation, it's, you guys, we don't have any influence. We don't get any influence on what the numbers are going to be. The numbers are what the numbers.
Eke it up and make it a little higher.
I'll tell you, that's where the pricing can differ from value. And that's where the experience between a valuation specialist and a business intermediary, that's the bridge. We're going to have, I just recently, I'm putting a deal together, probably 30% more than what one of the valuation approaches might be. And that's because I know what the values of the multiples are in that industry, in that specific situation, in that contracting. So, but the nature of the business is important. When we talk about contractors, think of how many different ways you can skin a cat. If you're an HVAC contractor, maybe you're a geothermal guy, maybe you're a high velocity air conditioning guy, maybe you're a heat pump guy, maybe you're the fireplace guy or the pellet stove person, that in your community or in your market. All those things kind of change the flavor of how we look at that valuation in terms of multiples, especially where you might be, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but most contractors fall in 4 different categories. They can be in a construction and engineering space. They can be in a wholesale and distribution space, business services, or consumer goods and services. They can fall into all 4 of those areas, and others as well, potentially, just depending on the scope of their work and the flavor of their business.
Or they could be actually a little narrower and they're only in one.
Right.
Which either one of those can either help or hurt.
Absolutely. And that's, again, where the valuation will bring out some information that maybe there's something we need to do. Maybe we need to make a change. Maybe we need to private label a particular product that we're having a lot of success with. Maybe we need to, look at a particular part of our financials and try to get control over something. Maybe it's our cost of goods sold. Maybe it's our cost of sales. Maybe it's how we account for
percentage of material as
absolutely. And if you're doing your program, you have that. And so your customers, your clients already have that. And it's so valuable. It is so valuable. You cannot underscore that, because you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in difference in value. Sometimes more. In that case that I had just mentioned, you're looking at $1 million plus, difference. And that's based on, the valuation, but the pricing and knowing.
And the expertise of what you bring to the table.
Right.
Cool.
Right.
Good. All right.
General economic outlook, what's the expectation for the economy? What's the general outlook for the business? It's important for us to know that. Obviously, our clients are going to have a great amount of insight into that. We have some cursory experience in most industries, but when we're working with somebody, I always tell people, you're going to know more about your business than I'm ever going to know. Now, when it comes to contracting, it's a little bit different story for me, because I grew up my dad was a general contractor. I've run in a large, fairly decent sized HVAC electrical plumbing company. So I have some experience, but I've been removed from it long enough that I still rely on my clients. Right. Because there's things that I don't know. Supply chain would be a perfect example of that. How people purchase in the HVAC space has traditionally been a little bit different than your typical widget manufacturer.
Right.
And so with that, or any service industry, actually. So with that, the effects are there, but with blanket orders, there's a little bit better understanding of timelining projects with HVAC. So it's not as important as it is in some other industries where think of automotive manufacturers or electronics manufacturers, where they can't get a processor or a chip. Right. Because it's just not there. And they don't have that option because they've never worked under that constraint or that limitation. So just understanding, though, the general economic outlook, very important. Could be things like price of gas, propane. We're seeing it. We saw a slight increase, now a slight downturn. But there's a big difference in global how the global economy is going to affect the local economy.
And so one of those things, and your comment just triggered it here again, is one of the things that, again, the recent bill that was signed by the president puts in place, actually puts, for example, HVAC, believe on the pool side in certain areas of the country, we'll see a heavy influence or a heavy impact on heat pumps.
Yep.
Where they're actually heavily subsidizing the end user customer to move to a heat pump, whether it's for the pool, whether it's for the heating the home, whether it's heating hot water, that they will actually provide. You're going to see rebates start to come back on that. So something like that. Does
Absolutely.
that start to impact it?
Absolutely. It could be other economic factors. If you're an electrician and you're doing solar, there's a big dust up right now. There's a lawsuit against Generac, and who knows what's going to come of it, but that's a dust up. Can something like that, where a major top 10 solar company is in litigation with a supplier, how can that affect the overall appetite for solar? And how does that, so those are all things that we have to consider when we're looking at the general economic outlook. And again, our clients typically have that right under control.
Sure.
So very important to understand.
All right.
Relevant historic financial statements.
Yeah.
So important. We just got done talking about the importance of accurate financials. We talked a few episodes back about how owner's equity, sometimes people will put in, they'll have something on their balance sheet that really doesn't belong there. And I've seen that. We've got a vacation property that's on our books, and we're using it for conferences or whatever, but that's all well and good, but it's not going with the business, so it shouldn't be on the books.
Or that flip side where we use company funds, really the retained earnings to pay for it,
right?
But we never really reported we took the cash out of the company,
right? And that's going to be a huge red flag. And a buyer who's savvy at any level, and they all, for the most part, are.
Sure. Yeah.
They're going to understand how to read the financials as well as or better than we do. The reality is you have to have accuracy, and you want to have a repository of that information. I always say keep it for 7 years at a minimum, but most buyers are going to look at 3 to 5 years. If they identify a trend or a concern that throws up a red flag, they might want additional data.
Sure.
They might want answers as to why something is the way it is.
Looking the way it is.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
So you talked about the financial statements, right? Calculate financial ratios. There was also one of our previous episodes where we actually shared a document from one of the industry organizations that gave you for the HVAC industry, right? So if some of you are in some of the other trades, let us know. We can get you the same data for the other trades. But what are some key ratios that the industry is looking for? And so we'll share that one in the chat box again right now. So again, just double click on that and you can download it. But there's a ton of good information in there. Again, if you're in some other trade, just let us know. We'll get you that information as well as we dig into that one. So what about some of the other, is that really kind of getting through the analyzing the financials and compare financial ratios?
Yeah, I think, and analyzing the financials, we're going to look at those ratios. We're going to look at the quick ratio, the current ratio. The ratios that determine health. I recently, actually, as recently as this morning, I had an accounts receivable that's kind of inflated, and the buyer that I'm working with in this particular, it's outside of the contracting industry, but this particular buyer says, well, that's awful high for the industry, because he's in the industry, so he knows.
Right.
And I said, well, let's get an accounts receivable aging report and really drill down and see what exactly is happening. And the concern is, if that's out of whack, that a buyer might say, well, you have people over 60 days or 90 days, and they're taking advantage of you because you're not charging for that or whatever.
For use of the money.
You're giving them a free loan essentially. And when a buyer sees that, one of the things they think is, well, I'm not going to let that happen. So I'm going to lose that. So that sale is going to be gone. And, so that's a huge consideration.
So then, when I see a company that's got a very large receivable balance, one of the questions I have to ask is, okay, you mentioned the aging. How old is it? At one point, when we come to, and all of this is applying directly to marketing your company, at what point is a receivable not a receivable when it comes time to sell the business, right? Because at some point, it's just a bad debt, right? And you got to recognize it. At what point do you say, okay, beyond X number of days, you got to recognize where we are?
And that's the analysis of historical. Every company and industry and area is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. That's where we have those ratios that we compare by within the industry. Mm-hmm. And we look at things geographically as well. But when we look at it by the industry, that gives us a fair amount of expectation for aging. I think when you get over 120 days, you have some problems. 90 days, well, you have to look at it on a case by case, but 90 days is a long time. I mean, there's ways to reduce that. And I know we've talked about that. There's ways to reduce that days to pay, create an incentive for somebody to pay you early or on time. Having that in place, that process system, having that system in place pays dividends all the way up until the sale of your company. Mm-hmm. So it's not something that, we'll spot it in evaluation, certainly, but it isn't something that we need to, that we would put off. I mean, it's something that we can address immediately.
Sure. So, let me ask this question, right? Because you were looking at some of these items, right? We're about to go to the next page. And again, we got another whole list of items. But the topic of the program is marketing your company. Mm-hmm. Right. So again, circling back around to that piece of the puzzle, one of the things I think about with this is it's not like if you're going to market a company, it's not like you're running an ad in the local newspaper. Right. I mean, it's all of this information that you are literally almost hand delivering in some cases, or you're going out looking for somebody who fits this.
Right. And we'll talk about the marketing lab, but identifying that prospective buyer, where he's at, where is he? Where is he geographically? Right. Where is he mentally? Where is he financially? Where is he professionally? All those things have to be considered as part of the marketing concept, like when we're marketing the business. But the marketing of the business encompasses all of those things. Absolutely. When it comes to financials, oftentimes we require a confidentiality agreement before we'll release those. And most of the time, that's how I operate, where it may be a non-confidential listing where it's out there in the ether. People can, if they're actively looking for a business and they're going, they're searching out a specific type of business, they're going to come across. We own, oh gosh, I don't even know how many. It's over a couple thousand keywords that we dominate in our particular spaces that we work within. But if they Google a particular keyword, it's gonna come up for us. But that being said, if we have if we have the financial information and we have that confidentiality agreement, then we are hand delivering it to the potential buyer. Sometimes it's part of the book, our marketing book. Sometimes we include it, the financials, and we don't always include the drill down detail, but we might include the EBITDA or the seller's discretionary earnings, and depending on the industry. Typically with contractors, we don't do that simply because the buyer base isn't as sophisticated as it is in some other industries. They're not going to say, oh, well, the seller's discretionary earnings is a multiple of 4.5. Most of the time, they're going to say, let me see the financials, and then we'll share those financials with them.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next. There's a couple more items that fall under this valuation piece of the puzzle, right? So prepare a 5-year projection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is the future expectation of where the company is going? Mm-hmm. That, again, systems and processes, we talk about it over and over again, but what if we have for instance, I'm a recovering marketing guy. I used to own a marketing company. So, there's very specific metrics we can look at when it says, when it comes to marketing.
Sure.
If we do 50,000 impressions and we get, 50,000 impressions and we get 250 click throughs, how many of those are going to be actionable that we can actually, potentially close on? And then of that, how many will we close?
Right.
And so the same thing with sales, 10-3-1. A lot of times, I'm going to go see 10 people, present to 3 of them, and, one of them is going to buy. Well, if I need to make 50 sales with a lifetime client value of X,
suddenly you got to do 500 calls.
Exactly. And so, what is that projection? If we have that system in place, now we can start to project expectations.
Sure.
We can manage those expectations.
Mm-hmm. And this is where, so really this 5-year projection gets into not only what are you as a business owner doing. So then I would have, my first question is, okay, what does your business plan look like? Right? What are your plans moving forward?
And I always ask, and a business plan is great. I look at my business plan often for my businesses, but most people don't.
Right.
They don't look at the bank needs a business plan. They go to the SBA website or they go to Google and they go, here we go. Or they call me and I send them a specific business plan template for a particular industry. Which is all well and good, but if you don't look at it, it really doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot.
That's right.
I'm a big activity plan guy. What are the metrics we're going to look at?
Right.
And how do we get there? Once we've started down that path and we can measure it, now we can project. And that's so important. Activity, a company that measures not only its financials, but its activity is one that I can add a lot of value to because now I can do a pro forma, which is a future projection based on an increase based on activity.
Sure.
Which we can't always do. In normal circumstances, if somebody isn't doing that, it makes it very difficult. We can say, well, if you went up 10% a year, yeah, exactly. This is what you look like. But having something that we can qualify is very important.
Right. That, and that's where I come back. And again, I've heard companies say that before. Well, my plan is to grow the company by 10% per year for the next 3 years, and then I'm out. I'm going, great. What are you doing?
How are you going to do that?
What was your growth the last 3 years? Well, we lost 5% each year. Well, okay. What are you changing? Right. Because if you're not changing anything, right. Same thing. Okay. So,
and that's a historical, that's the value. The valuation will gives you that baseline. Now you have historical data. You can do a trend analysis. So important.
Right.
So important.
Okay. So analyze goodwill.
Goodwill is one of those things that is very difficult to put a number on. It's somewhat, it's kind of subjective in a lot of ways. Goodwill are the things over and above the financials. We've talked in the past about human capital. Yep. What's the availability of human capital? What's the market share? What's the opportunity for increasing that market share? Competition. We talked about risks and risk management and contingency planning. What are those risks that we manage? What do those look like? Those are all important considerations. So when we're looking at goodwill, it's the over and above.
Sure. Again, having the right person in the right seat on the bus at the right time.
It's a system.
Having those systems and processes in place so that it can run by itself.
Absolutely.
And doesn't need to be there. Right. That's goodwill. That without that, the value of the company or what you can market it for is a lot less. Goodwill
often parallels. I find a parallel oftentimes with goodwill where when we see a company where the owner can step away and or work on the business instead of in it, the goodwill typically is a bigger number.
Sure. Okay. And again, that's one of those areas that just adds extra dollars to what I'm trying to get out of.
Correct.
Or what we're able to get out of. Okay. Correct. Historic earnings?
Historic earnings, like I used to be financial. I was a certified financial planner for a while. And, when you look at the historic data, they all say historic data is no indicator of future performance. Okay. And it is true, but you have to have something to start with. Right. So when you look at the historic earnings of a company, again, if you have that baseline number and we go back 5 to 7 years and we say, what's that trend analysis? Is that trend up, down, level? And why? If you can identify why, very important. So historic earnings are important.
Sure.
And also for the particular valuation methodology, we look at that.
Yeah. So if let's say we had 4 up years and now we got a down year. Right. Does that concern you?
Not necessarily. It depends on how we structure the review of the financials. If we do what's called a trailing 12, where we look at this point, right now we're in September. So if we look September to September, probably, and if you're in an HVAC situation and last year overall was a good year, probably not a bad situation to be in.
Right.
But we also look at year over year. We look at year to date. But it's kind of how you package it to a buyer.
Sure.
So that's the nuance of what we do as business intermediaries. It's how you package that. But most importantly, you have to be able to explain a down year, which it might be a personnel issue. It might be an economic issue. It could be a pandemic. Yep. It could be a catastrophe. All those things that we talked about during contingency planning. Yeah. It could be any one of those things.
Yeah. Well, and conversely, right, you mentioned pandemic, right? Many contractors through the pandemic was a wild up year.
Absolutely.
Right. Which is an anomaly.
Right.
Right. So that might not, looking at the future, let you market it quite as much as what maybe it looked like because it was.
Or did you take PPP money and you look really good?
Oh, yeah.
That's another thing. So accounting for that properly, extremely important. You have to be able to understand, but explain that to a potential buyer.
Okay. So before we go to the next one, and that just brings up another question for me real quick, is I didn't take a PPP, but I have an EIDL loan. And so that's kind of tied to the company. How does that impact me? Because there's a lot of contractors out there who are in that boat, right? How or does that affect me? Because that was a 30-year loan.
It can. It's a liability obviously on the balance sheet, so it can affect you. And there's, if insofar as future forgiveness is of that particular loan, I don't know what that's going to or will look like.
Sure.
There might be something involved with that. Based on the cost of that loan, which is extremely
low. I think it was 1.5%.
Yeah, it's really inexpensive. It isn't as strong of an effect as long as you can explain, again, being able to explain why you took the loan and how it advantaged the company in doing that. And maybe it was a bridge for, a particular financial investment to grow the company, or it was used in tandem with that. So it would free up other funds. Being able to explain that is the most important thing.
Okay, good. Having that thought through, and at least, and again, that's one of those things. Obviously, when you see somebody's P&L and you see that on the balance sheet,
it's
right. You're going to
want to know about that. Yeah, I'm going to ask why. Determining selling price. That's part of the valuation process, I guess you would say, kind of. The pricing again doesn't always mirror the valuation value. Sometimes it's higher. It could be lower. It's typically not, depending on which approach we take. The valuation oftentimes are a little bit lower. Sometimes we take the recommendation because that valuation methodology, especially with what we'll talk about, the market approach, that methodology might be right on.
Sure.
And there may not be any extenuating circumstances that raise it above. So I don't want our audience to think that your valuation is here and your price is always here. It does happen, but I wouldn't say it's the usual. Sure. I would say it happens, a fair amount of times that we need to make sure that we're addressing it because price and value aren't always exactly the same.
You're exactly right. No question. All right. So that brings us to those valuation methods then.
Yes.
Right. So the three, if you could kind of cover these here.
Well, the asset approach really looks at the net asset value of a company. It looks at the assets less the liabilities. It's most important to understand is it's based on the market value of those assets. So, that Milwaukee drill that you paid $200 for 5 years ago
has it gone up to $600?
It is not worth $600. Even though the new ones might be $600 today, it's not valued at that. So there's a true depreciation allowance that we have to look at. And it's the same thing when we look across the board. When we're looking at real estate, we look at things like the cap rate. What's the net operating income divided by the asset value? And that's your cap rate. And, how does that position us more favorably for a sale of real estate or less favorably?
Okay.
Sometimes business is sold with the real estate. Sometimes I have a recent situation where, hey, I want to hold on to my real estate. Okay. And I want to rent to the buyer for a period of years. Well, we obviously help them negotiate that and we get compensated on that. But, that can be a real advantage to both buyer and seller because the seller keeps the real estate that they want. They have passive income and the buyer,
which they don't pay federal or Social Security and
correct.
Medicare on.
Yep. And the buyer gets a discount on the overall business and they can defer some of the costs over a period of time. And, typically we have options to purchase that, will include with that or rights of first refusal in the event of a sale or attempted sale. Those situations, again, that's part of deal structure and how we set the process up. But that's all part of the process. And honestly, it can be part of the pricing process as well, because if we can get a little bit more on the passive income side, we can take a little less for the business.
Sure.
It can balance out.
It can work out. Okay.
So the income approach, that's basically the present value of future earnings or cash flow. So again, looking at that historical data,
present value of future earnings.
Present value of future earnings.
So I might be doing down the road.
How much is that
worth today?
In today's dollars, right? So that's what we're looking at. Think of it, oftentimes part of the methodology could be, one approach could be a gross income multiplier. So they might say, and that's not always typical because obviously it's a gross income multiplier. So it can or can't be depending on how.
What are the expenses that are
right. But having that gross, that's one of the positions a lot of companies look at as, that's a rule of thumb.
Sure.
That a lot of people say, oh, it's 2.5 or it's 3.6 of, the gross income, and not accurate, but it is something to look at. It's part of that approach. When we talk about what's important with the income approach, having a clean balance sheet, again, extremely, we talked about that a few minutes ago. It's so important to have a clean balance sheet and accurate because that is what most of this methodology is predicated upon. It's accuracy on the financials. When we look at the income approach, it's the numbers approach, essentially. So there's a few different ways to go about it. And within our valuation process, we look at a couple of different ways to do that. But the long and the short of it is it's the net asset value. The market approach, which I oftentimes find myself working within, I like the market approach because of my experience in the markets that in sectors that I work in. And I do see oftentimes, it's not always the case, but oftentimes the market approach gives us, it might be a little bit higher than the income approach or the asset approach. The asset approach, if there was a liquidation of assets, that would be where an asset approach, if the company was insolvent or had some problems, and an asset approach might be the most accurate or, the most germane to a sale. But the market approach, that's used when we want to develop a price, I guess, for a business. So that's often what I look at because it takes into account the goodwill. It takes into account the goodwill. It takes into account those other factors that we talked about. It looks at done deals, like what deals have been completed and reported. And what were those numbers when it comes to EBITDA, earnings before income taxes, depreciation and amortization, or seller's discretionary earning? What were those multiples for those previously sold sales? And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the market approach, oftentimes we always look at the public company sales. That's part of it as well in our particular industry. It's very straightforward. It's real and public data. So it's not a ethereal, I'm guessing on this. It's, it's not that, but there is a component of opinion, not opinion, I shouldn't say, but there's
a little bit subjective.
A little bit subjective in how we look at specific data.
Yeah.
And that's the downside of it is some people will question the appropriateness of the data that's used. And so we need to spell that out very specifically. And comparisons can be difficult. That's the other downside to a market approach. Kind of what we talked about earlier. I mean, how many ways can you skin a cat? There's so many ways to run an HVAC company or an electrical company.
It's not like we're comparing a 3-bedroom ranch and a 3-bedroom ranch, right?
Right.
A little bit different scenario there.
This one's got a 3-bedroom, but one of them is an office, and one of them has one of the 3 bedrooms is a studio or you know, I mean, yeah. So there's so many different ways to look at it that becomes a little bit difficult sometimes. But that's the long and the short of the 3 approaches.
And you'll actually typically use more than one and then use kind of a combination.
We look
to come up with your selling.
When we do evaluation, we use each one of these 3 approaches, and then we'll use methodology within each one of those 3 approaches, sometimes 1 or 2 different methods to get to that particular number.
Yep. Okay. Very good. So then, what do we got next then? I think next is this idea of, you mentioned multipliers before.
Right. Yeah. When we look at multipliers, this is just kind of I just wanted to share this because the multiples, there's so many rules of thumb websites and guys out there and, you did 2.2. It really depends. When you look at this particular slide, each one of those 4 areas, construction and engineering, wholesale and distribution, business services, or consumer goods and services, the reality is a contractor can fall into any one or all or some of those 4. And so what I've seen historically is if you look at the numbers in red, starting on the left side, the EBITDA, the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, for companies that are sized with EBITDAs between 0 and 1 million, which is pretty typical for most of the people in our audience. Those are going to be, the multiple is going to be 3.8. Now I have seen a little bit of an uptick there, where we're seeing that 4 to 4.5 multiple, insofar as, done deals.
Yep.
And the reason for that is, again, that price and that value isn't always exactly the same. Sometimes the value is higher. I'm working with one, contractor in the Midwest right now, and he's at 5.5, and I'm not getting any pushback from seller or buyers on that particular multiple. I mean, it's, hey, we want to know more about it. So companies that are between 1 and 5 million EBITDA, we're seeing about 5.8, and that's pretty consistent. 5 to 10 million, 6.5 multiplier. So that basically means if you had a $5 million or let's say a $6 million EBITDA, 6 times 6.5 gives you the value of that company.
Sure.
10 to 25 million, you can see 7.5. And then when we get larger, we see a much larger multiplier. And, obviously those are established businesses.
And kind of their own machine.
And there's a lot of money that you can lose before you have problems. That's why. And I think, I always say that might be the big reason why that number is so high.
Sure.
But if you look at each one of those particular areas, you'll notice that consumer goods and services, the smaller companies, that's oftentimes where we see a focus. But when you get a little bit larger, that distribution and that wholesaling concept, the larger accounts that you're landing with, the larger volume, maybe a slightly lower margin, but you can see the multipliers go up. And then when you're very large, again, back to consumer goods and services, sometimes it's because proprietary or private private labeling becomes something that is more common.
Sure. Okay. But the key message with this graphic is that there is no one multiplier that you can apply.
No, it's a case by case basis. It's so oftentimes geographic. We look at when we're arriving at the conclusion of value, we have to look at everything from history, finances, personnel, people, longevity, experience, profiling.
Right.
We talked about profiling, and assessments with folks. So important to consider that. Goodwill, obviously, all those things are important. And we have to look at transactional data from other companies in the industry.
Yep.
What are they doing?
Yep.
What is we talked about accounts receivable, aging. Okay, well, what's the industry average, and where do we fall?
How do you compare?
And that all has an impact.
Good. All right. So, Glenn, we've got a couple of areas, high level areas, right? Because we're looking at about 10 minutes of our time left. And so just kind of cover these in terms of the marketing process.
Sure. Well, it starts obviously again with the valuation. That's the whole basis for what we do. We need to get values. We need to get financials. But the discovery process allows us as brokers to get insight into the company's history, experience, human capital, the strengths, the unresolved opportunities. I don't like to call them weaknesses, leadership issues, economic considerations, all that stuff, and marketability of the company. If you got a horrible reputation, guess what? You're hard to sell.
Right?
Yeah. And a lot of people don't really think about that, but that's part of the discovery process is what are people saying about us? We talk about how are people developed? What processes exist? That discovery process is essentially a very large questionnaire that starts out with what's your name, your email, how old are you? You get all that demographic analysis, but then we really dig deep and we learn about the company. It's an exhaustive process that doesn't end with the discovery questionnaire that we provide. We're constantly asking questions of our customers because things are going to, our clients are going to, something's going to happen or somebody's going to ask a question and we're going to need to get that information. When are the busiest times of the year? What are the factors that influence future earnings? So all that stuff.
You have a proprietary discovery process.
We do.
That you use.
It's very unique. It's, 12 or 14 pages long. We have it in form of a fillable PDF that when somebody's serious about working with us, then, that becomes available. We don't give that out. We don't, we won't be unfortunately providing that for everybody today simply because it is proprietary and it is information that sets us apart in the marketplace.
And that's one of those things that you have that enables you to get a little bit more information. And on the surface, it may not. You go, okay, well, how is this proprietary? But it enables you to get information deeper into the company.
It's a process. Some people call it a fact finder. Some people call it a discovery agreement or discovery process or questionnaire. It's just a way to really drill deep down into knowing that business as well as we can look at it before we do go into the marketing lab.
And the whole idea behind that is to ultimately enable you to get as much for that business as you possibly can.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the key goal because, I'm a commission guy.
Right.
The more I get for that business, the more I get paid too.
Yep.
And
so you certainly want to do that.
And I have a recent, I'm selling some land and I told my client, I said, I'm going to try to get you an additional 50,000. And I said, I don't want to sell her the deal, but I think, there's a little room in that. And he's like, well, that'd be great. I'm like, that's a new truck. Well, half of a new truck anyway.
Right?
But, it's those little things and you really have to push for every nickel and dime where we can.
Okay.
The marketing lab, though.
You mentioned this term a few times.
Yeah, it's something that we do that's unique to the industry. I don't know of anybody that does it as a formalized process. We have a pretty big back office. So we have specializations in marketing, valuation, lease and real estate specifically. And unlike most business brokers, our firm is independent contractors, just like they all are. But what separates us and makes us unique is that we all work together. So we come together for a marketing lab. If one of my associates has a lot more experience in a particular niche, because we all get referred into different niches. They're going to bring me in. I'm going to bring them in to collaborate to get the most out of the opportunity. And, we all take care of each other in those situations. So that's what really makes it unique. What we do within the marketing lab, we identify things like associations. We were talking about that. I know you've got a trip coming up that you're going to be speaking to an association. I love to know what those are within, the context of a local geographic area. I obviously know the national players, but, Indoor Air Quality Association.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a friend who runs a Indoor Air Quality Association of sorts, and you know, he does a great job on that. But he gives me insight.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I have those particular conversations, like,
Right.
well, what do you see? What's trending in the industry? Well, COVID. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a huge component of it. But that association allows us to contact a lot of people. You know, those members
Sure.
are prospects as well. You know, we want to list and create develop a list for roll-up sales. You know, we talked earlier, larger companies looking to get some geographic market share. Who are those companies? We need to identify those. We need to know who's in the done deal world, you know, and I look at that data and say, well, who's been buying companies?
Sure.
And some of that's experience. You know, we're the oldest in our state as far as, you know, business brokers,
Mm-hmm.
but our experience is our advantage. And so we're able to capitalize on that. Trade magazines.
Mm-hmm.
What are the website and social media places that potential prospective buyers are visiting?
Sure.
We need to know that.
Mm-hmm.
Identifying private equity firms that might operate in the space. We subscribe to several services that
Mm-hmm.
connect us directly with private equity. You know, we can input data. We can input data to say, we have an HVAC company with this EBITDA, you know, this
Mm-hmm.
location, this amount of people, this kind of process driven, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get feedback from different private equity.
Sure.
They'll reach out to us. Who are the existing clients? Because we are the oldest in our state. We have a lot of people that have already purchased in specific sectors.
Sure.
Who's already done that? We've worked with. We sell.
And would they be interested in another?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And we develop in that marketing lab. Like what does a ideal buyer look like? What is that profile of that ideal buyer? And then we develop a list.
Mm-hmm.
We do that with our marketing team and our operations. Our CO is involved with that. You know, our valuation specialists will, you know, look at, because she has industry data.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll all look at all that information and we'll develop a list for the prospective mailers that we put out, email marketing, digital marketing, websites,
Mm-hmm.
how we're going to list it. We develop a master narrative on describing the business, because you get one shot to make
Right.
that first impression.
Yeah.
So, you know, we'll develop that master narrative. And we use that as a springboard for everything from what we call teasers, where we're, you know, putting out information, to our formal marketing book. And that's kind of the culmination of the marketing lab, is to develop that marketing book. They're usually, you know, a quarter of an inch plus thick. They're exhaustive as far as the data that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we have to gather for it, but it's extremely helpful for buyers. And it really does position us uniquely in the market. So oftentimes we see it's almost like a banner ad. Business for sale,
Yep.
Northeast
Right.
Wisconsin. You know, it's like, okay, we just want you to come and talk to us and we'll send you everything you need to know or want to know within, you know, you'll be at the 90% solution.
Yep.
But that's the long and the short of the marketing lab. Once we have once we have that book, you know, it's very important. Once that marketing process is complete, we're now in an active listing.
Mm-hmm.
And so protection of the business is so important. We have to protect the business during the sale. Now, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Well, when we have meetings, we're always going to have an intermediary or broker present every time. And the reason for that is buyers will sniff out chinks in the armor.
Mm-hmm.
If they get an inkling that there's a health issue or a divorce, you know, the D's,
Right.
as it were, if they get a hint of that, that just gives them, that's like blood in the water. So we want to be present for every meeting. For every meeting, we have an agenda. Doesn't mean we necessarily share it with everybody, but we're going to have an agenda as a broker.
Yeah.
That's something that our firm does. We have an agenda for every meeting that we have with buyers and sellers. Here's what I'm looking to accomplish. It's respectful of people's time, but it's also respectful of the process.
Sure.
We market in most cases to multiple buyers.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to just say, we're going to go after this particular buyer. Now there are situations. I'm in a situation right now where there was a distributor that had to approve a sale. And, you know, so there was a situation like that. And it was somebody that we're already working with on the buy, as a buyer. And so we were very limited into who we pitched that to before. And very quickly, just by the way it worked, we had a letter of intent and an offer fairly quickly. So that can happen. But just keeping the discussion with employees limited. We advocate for hiring a public relations firm. We have one that we refer often in situations where there's a transition of a business, and having that information put out the right way is very important.
The information about the transition.
Because
that can torpedo a company really quick.
Oh yeah. Oh, they're selling. I got to get a new job.
Absolutely.
And that's, you don't want to have a run on the human capital. That would be bad. Confidentiality in communications goes without saying. Everything we talk to clients about is confidential. You'll hear me talk in generalities, but I've never, in the process of discussions, talked about a specific company.
In all the years we've known each other, you've never.
Yeah, it's confidentiality. And we're oftentimes, in most cases, subject to confidentiality agreements with our buyers or with funding sources potentially. And, a lot of people will say, oh, we want to have a confidentiality agreement, non-disclosure agreement, normal course of business.
Sure.
We don't always specify the location of the business specifically because if let's say we were in Chitlin Switch, Arkansas, and there may or may not be a Chitlin Switch, Arkansas. I also think there might be, but if you are the only HVAC company in Chitlin Switch, Arkansas, and you put on there Chitlin Switch, Arkansas, instead of
everybody knows it's you.
Everybody knows it's you. So you got to be kind of careful of that. And again, confidential versus non-confidential listings. Confidential listings, there's certain people that don't want anybody to know they're for sale.
Right.
Because it could hurt them if they didn't sell, but people thought they were looking to sell.
Right.
And that's usually based on why they're selling. In most cases, that's not a consideration, and we would keep it non-confidential. Oftentimes I see myself doing a hybrid of confidential, non-confidential. I'll put it non-confidential, but the financials are confidential.
Sure.
If you want to see the financials, that's all well and good, but you got to sign this confidentiality agreement, this non-disclosure agreement.
Yep.
And then I'll share those with you. And that's protection for my clients.
Sure.
Excluded buyers list. There might be somebody, that's something that I talk about with people. Is there anybody who you don't want to sell this to?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I don't like it.
For whatever reason.
I didn't like this guy because, back in 1986, he stole my girlfriend at senior prom. I don't know. It could be anything, but I'm not selling to him. And it doesn't matter, but we want to make sure that we include an excluded buyers list in a contract if necessary. We talk about it. It's not typical, but it does happen. I've had situations where people have said, don't talk to these people if they call. It might be a close competitor that they know isn't going to buy them, but wants to get all the information on the financials and everything else. So I signed a CA, but okay, kind of thing. Yeah. And we really want to protect against that. So,
good. Okay.
And then finally, we look at experience of that. One of the things that we always look at is we vet buyers. When we're vetting buyers, we're looking at their ability to purchase. So we're looking at funding sources and letters of funding. We need to have proof of funds. And if it's an SBA loan, which oftentimes your clients it would be an SBA loan would be a perfect fit depending on, what type of SBA loan. But what we find is that with SBA loans, they're becoming increasingly more stringent in that they require experience in the field. So if you're trying to buy an HVAC company, guess what? If you haven't worked in the HVAC industry, they're going to ask you a lot of questions that you better be able to answer. So we want to review that with that buyer because it's very important. We do a monthly financial review, not a full recast, but we just talk every month about how are we doing? Keep the passion. When you lose your passion in the sale of a business, you lose value. Absolutely. And then attorney referrals, attorney involvement. We have specific M&A, mergers and acquisitions attorneys that we like to work with. I have a couple that I locally like to work with, and some regionally and some out of state that I enjoy working with that. We have that ability and we'll identify that when it's needed. Certain times it's not.
Mhm.
You know, we may have seen this and we can explain it, but we don't offer legal advice ever. We're not accountants, we're not attorneys, but if we see,
You know your lane.
we know our lane, and if we see an opportunity to protect our clients by having them represented and they don't have an attorney, we'll refer one.
Good. Okay.
So,
Now there's really two more, and we're going to cover these fairly quickly.
Yep.
Right. So transition.
yeah, the transition, I think the big thing there is employment agreements and consulting agreements, making sure that we have those in place before the sale, so that if the buyer wants to have somebody stay on for a time, we've negotiated that in advance, and it's not a big surprise. It's not going to be a deal killer.
Yep. And that's interesting because I know of an acquaintance of mine who owned his company, sold, didn't have that in place. Basically, they went and told the entire team, now he's going to continue to be here for the next 2 years, and 6 months later, he was gone.
Right. Now, we talked about this earlier. It's important to have that in stone. Like we need to know what that time is when that transition is going to be complete. But there are times, that an employment agreement transitions into a consulting agreement where, but those are all conversations that we have in the aftercare portion of after the sale. We talk about, we might in the transition refer an accountant or a financial planner. We need to make sure that the key suppliers and customers are introduced. That's part of the transition. Contacts databases, making sure those are transferred. And while we don't do that directly, we make sure that both parties,
facilitation,
because they may not think of it. CRM, client relationship management software, having a review of that and having an update and an understanding of where that is, and access and transfer of passcodes and passwords and passcodes are huge. Work and process review, that's huge because if you have a job that's being processed at any given time and it's 50% done, depending on how the deal is structured, you might be able to get 50% of that.
Sure.
Or maybe that's part of the deal is I get of my receivables. Well, and for that work and process, we need to consider that.
Yep.
And then aftercare, we talk about aftercare. We really review metrics, especially for things like earnouts. We talked about earnouts where, I wanted $2 million for the business, but they're giving me $1.5 million. But if I get to this level in working with them, then I get my extra money or more. And so we discuss that in the aftercare, and, that's a review that we can, with the seller, we can just talk about that. And where we can, we want to provide some referrals and things of that nature.
Sure. To enable hitting those objectives. Now, are you involved in that process?
In the design side, we do get somewhat involved with the design side in the deal structure.
Okay.
But ultimately it's how it's structured. Once it's put in place and agreed to, then, that's an operating agreement between the buyer and the seller.
Sure.
We talk about, again, we review employment and consulting agreements. If there are any concerns or issues, we review that. We want everybody to be happy. We want this business legacy to continue. We want, we want the buyer and the seller both to be
walk away happy.
We don't want, if it's a familial thing, we don't want Thanksgiving tasting different or Christmas dinner. If it's an outside, we don't want a reputational conflict in a community, because oftentimes we sell our business, we stay in the community that we worked in for 30 years or 20 years or whatever. Absolutely. We sit down with the buyer. I sit down with my buyers. I sit down with my sellers post sale and just, I do what I called it after action review. When I was in the military, we did that after every operation. After action review. How did it go? What could we do better? What didn't go well? And how can we change it?
Sure.
And I'm not perfect. My process isn't perfect. Somebody might say, well, I sent you an email. It took you 2 days to get back to me that one time. I really hated that. Okay, let me change that in my process.
I sent you an email. It took you 2 minutes. You got to change that.
You're on your phone all the time. And then testimonial development. I appreciate the opportunity. My business is predicated on my the goodwill of my clients.
Sure.
I mean, I don't advertise myself per se. I do webinars, occasionally, but I don't
call the next chapter.
Yeah, I don't actively like market myself. Other than I write a fair amount of articles just to keep people informed. But my network is 2,687 strong, and I send a quarterly email to all those people on my network.
Yep.
And that's how I build my business, and that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years.
Yep.
So testimonials, very important for us. Video, written. We have a structure for that, how we do that. And that might be something we can talk about too, because it works really well.
Sure.
And then referrals to buyer, whoever the buyer is, how do we cultivate referrals for them, and referrals from them? That's part of the aftercare as well. I want you to refer me.
Right. Absolutely.
I sold your business, and I helped you buy a business.
And again, anybody who's listening to this program should be doing that in their own business. Right?
Absolutely.
Right. Without a question.
It's so easy.
My guess is the more they do that, the more they recognize weak spots, the better they get. By gosh, the more goodwill we have. Right?
Absolutely.
So it goes all the way around in there. Well, wow. Again, we got into this thing. It's another, we're an hour and 10 minutes, so we're going a little bit long here, but a ton of good information in terms of marketing the company. And so, again, this program, the next chapter, is brought to you by Contractor Academy. Again, it's there's so many areas, so many things that we talked about that really get into improving the business. And as you started out saying, it's kind of at the inception of the business where we start growing things. So for as little as $29 a month, we've got the ability to get training, really for you, right? In a lot of different areas, whether it's communication, whether it's business, whether it's technical, whether it's, growing your business to make it more valuable, work you down that process, get you working on those individual steps in that timeline that we had shared with you earlier. Multiple levels. You can do just yourself. You can actually provide training for your entire team. And so there's a couple of different levels. Each level gives you a little bit more in there. So Glenn, we're going to do this again, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Right. So the next program that we've got, the next edition of the next chapter will be on October 12th at 12 o'clock noon Central Time. And the program, we're going to talk about pitfalls and possibilities. Right. So what are we going to talk about in a nutshell?
Well, I think we're going to talk about, we're going to do a case study of a successful transaction, what we would consider a successful transition. And maybe parallel that with a not so successful transaction.
And really what some of those differences were?
What those differences were in each one of the areas that could be positive or negative.
Right. Yeah, it can help you or hurt you, no question. So we'll send a link out to register for that one in the in the follow up with the recording for this particular program. And Glenn, they can reach you direct, right?
Absolutely. You can reach me at gherman at cbs-global.com, or you see my phone number, 262-719-2270. I generally return phone calls around 10 and 3 in the afternoon. So I do work from dark till dark. So don't feel like you can't leave me a voicemail.
And that was 10 in the morning, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And again, if we can help you here at Grandy & Associates, certainly reach out to me direct at Bill Kennard at Grandy Associates, or call our office at 877-202-8891. With that, this has been this edition of The Next Chapter. Make a decision to make it a profitable day.